The spring morning in Portland, Maine carried the scent of salt air and old paper as estate appraiser Daniel Brooks stepped into the cluttered Victorian home on Cumberland Avenue. The elderly owner had passed away 3 months prior, leaving behind generations of accumulated belongings that now needed cataloging and sale. Daniel had appraised hundreds of estates in his 20-year career, but something about this particular house felt different, heavier, as though the walls themselves held secrets they were reluctant to release. He moved methodically through the rooms, his trained eye separating valuable antiques from common household items. The third-floor attic proved the most challenging, packed with trunks, furniture, and boxes that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of light, piercing through the small dormer window as Daniel carefully opened a cedar chest near the back wall. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating muslin cloth, he found a collection of photographs, daguerreotypes, tintypes, and early paper prints documenting a family's history from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s. Most were predictable: stiff-posed wedding portraits, solemn children in their Sunday best, stern-faced patriarchs standing beside their properties. Daniel had seen thousands of such images, each one a frozen moment of lives long finished. But one photograph stopped him cold. It was larger than the others, roughly 10 by 12 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing that had yellowed with age. The image showed a rural farmstead, a weathered wooden house, a split-rail fence, fields stretching into the distance. Standing before the house were 9 people, a man and woman in their 40s, clearly the parents, and 7 children ranging from what appeared to be teenagers down to a toddler. The photograph itself wasn't unusual. What caught Daniel's attention was something subtle, something his years of experience had trained him to notice. 3 of the children looked different from the others, not physically, but in their positioning, their clothing, the way they stood slightly apart from the family group. Their expressions held something the other children's didn't: wariness, perhaps, or an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Daniel turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded brown ink, someone had written, "Whitmore Farm, Nebraska Territory, April 1887. He pulled out his magnifying loupe and examined the image more carefully, his heartbeat quickening as details emerged that shouldn't have been there. Details that transformed a simple family portrait into something far more troubling. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he held the magnifying glass over the photograph, moving inch by inch across the faces of the children. The 3 who had caught his attention stood on the right side of the group: a girl who appeared to be about 8 years old, a boy, perhaps 6, and a smaller girl who couldn't have been more than 4. Their clothing was wrong, subtly, but unmistakably wrong for a family photograph of this era and apparent social standing. While the other 4 children wore clean, well-fitted garments that matched in style and quality, these 3 wore mismatched pieces that didn't quite fit. The older girl's dress was too short at the hem, revealing worn boots that had been repaired multiple times. The boy's shirt sleeves ended well above his wrists, and the fabric looked coarser than what the other children wore. But it was their faces that troubled Daniel most profoundly. In an era when photographers demanded absolute stillness during the long exposure times, all 9 subjects had remained remarkably still, except for subtle details visible only under magnification. The 3 children on the right showed signs of having moved slightly during the exposure, creating the faintest blur around their features. More significantly, their expressions were markedly different from the others. The 4 children who clearly belonged to the family stood with the practiced composure of people accustomed to being photographed, their faces arranged in the serious but relaxed expressions typical of the period. The 3 others looked tense, almost fearful. The oldest girl's jaw was clenched. The boy's eyes were wider than they should have been, showing white around the iris. The smallest child gripped the older girl's hand so tightly that even in the photograph, Daniel could see the tension in their fingers. He noticed something else: fresh scratches on the boy's face, barely visible but there nonetheless. And on the older girl's neck, partially hidden by her collar, what appeared to be a bruise. Daniel set down the loupe and picked up his phone, photographing the image in high resolution. As an appraiser, he had learned to trust his instincts, and every instinct told him this photograph documented something wrong, something hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary family portrait. He reached for his laptop and began researching. "Whitmore Farm, Nebraska Territory, 1887. He typed into the search engine, not expecting much. Homesteads from that era rarely left significant records. But within minutes, he found something that made his breath catch. A brief mention in a digitized newspaper archive from the Omaha Daily Herald, dated June 1887. Whitmore family of Custer County praised for Christian charity in taking in orphaned children following county land disputes. Land disputes. Orphaned children. Daniel's mind raced as he cross-referenced dates and locations, the pieces of a puzzle beginning to emerge from the shadows of history. For 3 days, Daniel barely left his office. The estate sale could wait. This photograph had awakened something in him, a need to understand what he was seeing. He contacted historical societies, courthouse archives, and genealogical researchers across Nebraska, asking about the Whitmore family and Custer County land disputes in the 1880s. The responses came slowly, but each one added another piece to an increasingly disturbing picture. A researcher at the Nebraska State Historical Society sent him digitized land records showing that between 1885 and 1887, Custer County had experienced a wave of farm foreclosures. The severe winter of 1886-1887, known historically as the Great Die-Up, when hundreds of thousands of cattle perished across the plains, had devastated many homesteaders. Families who couldn't pay their debts lost their land to banks and speculators. The Whitmore family, Daniel learned, had been among the more prosperous farmers in the area. They owned significant acreage and had survived the harsh winter relatively intact. County records showed that in March 1887, just 1 month before the photograph was taken, they had acquired 3 adjacent properties through sheriff's sales, foreclosures of neighboring farms. Daniel's pulse quickened as he read the names of the foreclosed properties: the Henderson Farm, the Morrison Farm, and the Chen Farm. He searched for information about these families, finding census records from 1885 that listed them among the county residents. The Henderson family included 2 parents and 2 children, a daughter named Sarah, age 6, and a son named Thomas, age 4. The Morrison family had 1 child, a girl named Elizabeth, age 8. The Chen family, one of the few Chinese immigrant families in the county, had 2 young children listed. The census from 1890 told a different story. The Henderson, Morrison, and Chen parents were listed as having left the county. Whereabouts unknown, according to notation in the records. Their children were no longer listed at all in any census records under their original surnames. But when Daniel cross-referenced with other records, he found something chilling. In an 1888 school enrollment ledger from Custer County, 3 children were listed under the Whitmore family name: Sarah Whitmore, age 9, Thomas Whitmore, age 7, and Elizabeth Whitmore, age 9. The ages matched. The timing matched. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the photograph displayed on his computer screen. Those 3 children standing awkwardly on the right side of the Whitmore family portrait weren't distant relatives or hired help. They were the children of the families whose farms had been taken, their identities literally erased and replaced with the name of the family who had displaced them. But how had this happened? What had become of their parents? And why had no one questioned or investigated what appeared to be outright child appropriation? He needed to find court records, real documentation of what had occurred. With trembling hands, Daniel began composing an email to the Custer County Courthouse, requesting access to any civil or criminal case files from 1887 involving the Whitmore family or the displaced homesteaders. The answer, when it came 2 days later, would reveal a conspiracy of silence that had lasted nearly a century and a half. The email from Martha Reynolds, the Custer County clerk, arrived on a Tuesday morning. She had found something: boxes of old case files from the 1880s that had been moved to a storage facility during a courthouse renovation in the 1970s and largely forgotten. Among them were several documents related to the Whitmore family and the 1887 land foreclosures. But there was a problem. The files were fragile and couldn't be shipped. If Daniel wanted to see them, he would need to come to Nebraska in person. 3 days later, Daniel found himself driving through the vast, flat expanses of central Nebraska, the spring wheat creating an endless sea of green under a cloudless sky. Broken Bow, the Custer County seat, was a small town that seemed barely changed from its 19th century origins: brick storefronts lining Main Street, a courthouse built in 1892 dominating the town square. Martha Reynolds met him in the courthouse basement, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and careful hands. She led him to a table where she had arranged several document boxes, their contents protected by acid-free folders. "I read these after I found them," she said quietly, her Nebraska accent soft and measured. "You should prepare yourself. What happened to those children? It's not a pretty story." The first document Daniel examined was a sheriff's notice dated March 15, 1887, declaring the Henderson farm subject to immediate foreclosure and eviction due to unpaid debts totaling $342. a sum that represented 2 years of struggle against drought, failed crops, and the devastating winter. The eviction was to be carried out within 72 hours. The second document, dated March 18th, was a deputy sheriff's report describing the eviction. The language was bureaucratic and cold, but between the formal phrases, Daniel could read the violence. Resistance encountered. Force necessary to remove occupants. Property secured for auction. Occupants departed county. But it was the third document that made Daniel's hands shake. A petition filed with the county court on April 2, 1887, by Robert Whitmore, the patriarch of the family in the photograph. The petition requested legal guardianship of 3 minor children: Sarah Henderson, age 6, Thomas Henderson, age 4, and Elizabeth Morrison, age 8. The reason given: parents deceased or departed, children found abandoned on foreclosed properties, Christian duty to provide care. The petition had been approved by Judge Harold Wickham on April 5, 1887, just days before the photograph was taken. There was no documentation of the parents' deaths, no inquiry into their whereabouts, no investigation into whether the children had truly been abandoned or forcibly separated from their families during violent evictions. Martha handed Daniel another folder. "There's more," she said. "I found this in a different file box, from 1889. It was a letter, written in a shaky hand on lined paper, addressed to Judge Wickham, but apparently never answered or acted upon. The letter was from a woman named Mary Henderson, written from an address in Denver, Colorado. Daniel read the letter twice, his throat tight with emotion. "Your Honor, I write to you concerning my children Sarah and Thomas Henderson, who were taken from me in March of 1887 when we were forced from our farm. I was told by the sheriff's men that if I did not leave Custer County immediately, I would be arrested for vagrancy and my children placed in an orphanage. My husband James was struck by a deputy during the eviction and injured so severely that he could not travel. We were separated, and I do not know where he is now or if he still lives. I left under duress, believing my children would be cared for temporarily by the county until I could send for them. I have written to the sheriff's office 4 times with no response. A friend who remained in the county has informed me that my children are now living with the Whitmore family, who purchased our farm at auction. She says they are being called by the Whitmore name and told that we are dead. Your Honor, I am not dead. My children are not orphans. I am working in Denver and saving money to return for them. I beg you to investigate this matter and restore my children to me. They were taken unlawfully, and I have never consented to their adoption or guardianship by any party. Please, Your Honor, I am their mother. They belong with me." The letter was dated August 12, 1889, more than 2 years after the eviction. There was no record of any response from Judge Wickham. No investigation was ever opened. Mary Henderson's plea had simply been filed away and forgotten. Martha's voice was gentle but firm. There are 2 more letters in here. One from a man claiming to be Elizabeth Morrison's uncle, written in 1890. Another from someone identifying themselves as a representative of the Chen family, written in 1888. Both asking about the children. Both apparently ignored. Daniel carefully photographed each document, his mind reeling from the implications. This wasn't just a case of informal adoption during hard times, a practice that, while ethically questionable, had been relatively common on the frontier. This was systematic child theft, enabled by law enforcement and sanctioned by the courts, targeting families at their most vulnerable moment. Why would they do this? Daniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. The Whitmores had 4 children of their own. Why take 3 more? Martha pulled out one final document, a ledger page from the county assessor's office, dated 1888. It showed the Whitmore farm's valuation and noted that the property included 7 children of working age available for agricultural labor. Free labor, Martha said bluntly. Those 3 children were assets, like cattle or equipment. The parents were disposed of, the children were legally appropriated, and everyone who had the power to stop it either looked the other way or actively participated. Daniel thought of the photograph, of those 3 children standing apart from the family, their fear and confusion captured forever in silver salts and chemistry. The image took on a new and terrible meaning. It wasn't a family portrait. It was documentation of a crime. Daniel returned to Maine with copies of all the documents, but the photograph and the case files haunted him. He couldn't let the story end here, buried in courthouse basements and forgotten archive boxes. These children deserve to have their true identities known, their story told. And somewhere, there might be descendants who had no idea what had happened to their ancestors. He began with genealogical databases, searching for any trace of the Henderson, Morrison, and Chen families after 1887. The task proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. Common surnames, scattered records, families that had fractured and spread across the country in the wake of their losses. After weeks of searching, he found a breakthrough, a family tree posted on a genealogy website by a woman named Patricia Coleman in Sacramento, California. Her tree included a Mary Henderson, who had lived in Denver in the 1880s and 1890s, listed as having had 2 children, Sarah and Thomas, with the notation, "Children's fate unknown." Daniel sent Patricia a carefully worded message, explaining what he'd found and asking if she knew anything about Mary Henderson's story. The response came within hours, and it was longer than Daniel had expected. Patricia explained that Mary Henderson was her great-great-grandmother. Family stories passed down through generations told of a tragedy in Nebraska. Mary had lost her children during hard times and spent the rest of her life trying to find them. She had never stopped searching, writing letters and hiring investigators when she could afford it, traveling back to Nebraska several times, always returning without answers. Mary had eventually remarried in Denver and had 3 more children, but according to family accounts, she spoke about Sarah and Thomas until her death in 1923, always hoping they might somehow find their way back to her. The family had long assumed the children had died in the harsh Nebraska winter, or shortly after the eviction. "Are you telling me they survived?" Patricia's message asked. "That they were alive, just miles from the farm, being raised by the people who took our land?" Daniel explained everything he'd discovered. The guardianship petition, the photograph, the school records showing the children had been renamed. He attached high-resolution images of all the documents, including the letter Mary had written to Judge Wickham. Patricia's response came the next morning. "My grandmother, Mary's granddaughter, used to tell us that great-grandma Mary died of a broken heart. Now I understand what she meant. We need to find out what happened to Sarah and Thomas. We need to know the rest of their story." Over the following weeks, Daniel made similar connections with descendants of the Morrison and Chen families. Each conversation brought new pieces of the puzzle, new layers of grief and loss that had echoed through generations. The families had their own stories of ancestors who had disappeared into the Nebraska plains, of children who had vanished without explanation, of questions that had never been answered. Together, they began to reconstruct what had happened after that photograph was taken in April 1887. Through a combination of census records, school enrollment ledgers, and local newspaper archives, Daniel and the descendants began piecing together the lives the 3 children had lived on the Whitmore farm. What emerged was a picture of hardship, exploitation, and resilience. School attendance records showed that Sarah, Thomas, and Elizabeth attended the local one-room schoolhouse sporadically, far less regularly than the Whitmore biological children. County agricultural reports from the 1890s mentioned the Whitmore farm as one of the most productive in the area, noting its large family labor force as a key factor in its success. A breakthrough came when Patricia found a distant cousin who had inherited boxes of family papers. Among them was a letter written in 1901 by Sarah Henderson, now 14 years old, to a teacher who had briefly worked at the local school. The letter had never been sent. Perhaps Sarah had been afraid to mail it, or perhaps she'd had no way to post it. But she had kept it, folded small and hidden among her few belongings. The letter described her life on the Whitmore farm in stark terms. "We work from before sunrise until after dark, 7 days each week. The Whitmore's own children attend school in town now, but we are told we are needed in the fields and the house. Mrs. Whitmore is not cruel, but she is cold and reminds us often that we should be grateful for the roof over our heads. Mr. Whitmore says we owe a debt for our keep that we must work off, though the debt never seems to diminish no matter how hard we labor. I remember my mother. Thomas says he doesn't, but I know he does. I see it in his eyes sometimes when we work in the fields near where our old house used to stand. They tore it down for the lumber. Elizabeth remembers her mother too, and the uncle who used to visit them. We don't speak of these memories to each other often. It hurts too much, and there's no point in it. This is our life now." The letter revealed that the children had been told their parents were dead, that they had died of fever or had abandoned them. They had been given the Whitmore surname and instructed to forget their previous lives. Resistance, Sarah wrote, had been met with denial of food, confinement to the barn, or physical punishment. Yet the letter also showed Sarah's remarkable strength. She wrote of teaching Thomas and Elizabeth to read using whatever newspapers and catalogs she could find. She described protecting the younger children from the worst of the work when she could. taking on extra tasks herself so they might rest. She wrote of small rebellions, a wildflower picked and kept despite being told it was foolishness, a song her mother had sung that she hummed quietly while working. "I am not a Whitmore," she wrote near the end of the letter. "I am Sarah Henderson, daughter of James and Mary Henderson, and someday I will find a way to leave this place and discover what became of my parents. I will not forget who I am, no matter how many times they try to make me." Further research revealed that Sarah had indeed left the Whitmore farm, but not until 1904, when she was 17 years old. A brief mention in the Broken Bow newspaper reported that Sarah Whitmore had married a railroad worker named David Turner and moved to Lincoln, Nebraska. The marriage record showed her listed as Sarah Whitmore, ward of Robert and Catherine Whitmore, with no mention of her true identity. Through genealogical records, Daniel and the descendants traced Sarah's life after her escape. She had taken her brother Thomas with her when she left. He was 14 by then, old enough to find work. Together, they had started new lives in Lincoln, never returning to Custer County, never speaking publicly about their childhood on the Whitmore farm. But Sarah had kept documents: the letter to the teacher, a few photographs, a small notebook where she had written down everything she could remember about her parents and her early childhood before the eviction. These papers had been passed down through her descendants, who had always wondered about the strange, fragmentary stories their grandmother had told about Nebraska, but had never fully explained. Elizabeth Morrison's fate proved harder to trace. School records showed her attendance ending in 1895, when she would have been about 16. After that, she seemed to vanish from the historical record entirely. No marriage license, no death certificate, no census listing under either the Morrison or Whitmore name. It wasn't until a descendant of Elizabeth's maternal uncle found an old diary kept by a woman who had worked as a domestic servant in Omaha that they discovered what had happened. The diary entry from July 1895 mentioned a girl named Elizabeth who had appeared at a Catholic charity house, sick with pneumonia and refusing to give her surname. She had been taken in by the sisters who ran the charity and had recovered, but she had died 6 months later during a typhoid outbreak that swept through the city. The diary noted that Elizabeth had spoken often of wanting to find her family, of remembering a farm and an uncle who had promised to come for her. She had died believing herself alone in the world, never knowing that her uncle had indeed tried to find her, writing letters that had gone unanswered, making trips to Custer County only to be told the children had been legally adopted and could not be contacted. The Chen children's story remained the most elusive. The family had been part of a small Chinese immigrant community in Nebraska, and the racism of the era meant that their records were even more fragmented than those of the white families. What Daniel and the descendants eventually discovered suggested that the Chen children had been separated, one possibly sent to relatives in California, another potentially placed with a different family after leaving the Whitmore farm. The trail went cold, the lives scattered too far and too thoroughly to fully reconstruct. As Daniel and the descendants compiled their research, they faced a difficult question. What should be done with this information? The Whitmore family still had descendants living in Nebraska. The crimes committed were far beyond any statute of limitations. Everyone directly involved had been dead for decades, but the descendants of the stolen children felt strongly that the truth needed to be told. Patricia Coleman put it most forcefully during a video call with the research group. "My great-great-grandmother spent 40 years searching for her children, 40 years of grief and unanswered questions. She died never knowing they had been just 200 miles away, alive and working as unpaid labor on the farm that had been stolen from her family. If we stay silent, we're complicit in the same cover-up that the judge and the sheriff participated in. These children deserve to have their real names remembered." Daniel agreed. He drafted a comprehensive article documenting the entire story: the photograph, the eviction records, the court documents, Mary Henderson's letter, Sarah's account, and the genealogical research that had traced the children's fates. He submitted it to a history journal specializing in Western migration and frontier social issues. The article was published in the fall, accompanied by high-resolution images of the photograph and key documents. The response was immediate and overwhelming. News outlets picked up the story. Historians specializing in land appropriation and child welfare in the 19th century reached out with similar cases they had encountered. The article sparked renewed interest in examining courthouse records across the Plains states for evidence of similar practices. The Nebraska State Historical Society requested permission to use the photograph and documents in an exhibit about the darker aspects of frontier settlement. the displacement, exploitation, and injustices that had often been overlooked in traditional narratives of westward expansion. Most significantly, descendants of the Henderson, Morrison, and Chen families, some of whom had known nothing about this chapter of their family history, made contact with each other, forming connections across generations and geography. They shared photographs, documents, and stories, gradually building a more complete picture of their ancestors' lives. In Broken Bow, the current generation of county officials issued a formal acknowledgement of the injustices documented in the court records, though they stopped short of a full apology. The courthouse now included information about the case in its historical archives, no longer hidden in basement storage boxes but made accessible to researchers and the public. 6 months after the article's publication, Daniel stood in a gallery at the Nebraska State Historical Society in Lincoln. The exhibition, Hidden in Plain Sight: Injustice on the Frontier, had opened to the public that morning, and the centerpiece of the display was the 1887 Whitmore family photograph, enlarged to 4 feet wide and mounted behind protective glass. But the display was different from how the photograph had been presented in the Whitmore family for over a century. Instead of a single caption identifying it as a Whitmore family portrait, the museum had created individual labels for each person in the image. The 4 Whitmore children were identified by their birth names and dates. So were the 3 stolen children, but with their true identities restored. Sarah Henderson, born 1881, daughter of James and Mary Henderson, forcibly separated from her parents during the eviction of the Henderson farm, March 1887. Legally appropriated by the Whitmore family through questionable guardianship proceedings, April 1887. Fled the farm in 1904, reunited with her brother Thomas, lived until 1956. Thomas Henderson, born 1883, son of James and Mary Henderson, taken from his parents at age 4. Worked on the Whitmore farm until 1904, relocated to Lincoln with his sister Sarah, lived until 1961. Elizabeth Morrison, born 1879, daughter of Robert and Anna Morrison, separated from her family during farm foreclosure, March 1887. Worked on the Whitmore farm until 1895, died in Omaha of typhoid, January 1896, having never reunited with her family. Patricia Coleman stood beside Daniel, her eyes fixed on the photograph of Sarah Henderson, her great-great-aunt, a child she had learned about only through this investigation. Other descendants had traveled to Lincoln for the opening. Thomas Henderson's grandson, a retired teacher from Colorado, distant cousins of Elizabeth Morrison from 3 different states, representatives of the Chen family, still searching for the complete story of their ancestors' children. "They're not lost anymore," Patricia said softly, her hand touching the glass near Sarah's image. "Their real names are known now. Their story is told. That's what my great-great-grandmother wanted, just to know what happened to her children, to have them remembered for who they really were." The photograph that had hung in the Whitmore family home for over a century, documenting their apparent prosperity and respectability, now told a different story entirely. One of injustice, resilience, and the terrible human cost of frontier expansion. The 3 children standing apart from the family, their discomfort and fear captured in their postures and expressions, were no longer anonymous wards or forgotten orphans. They were Sarah, Thomas, and Elizabeth, children who had been stolen but who had fought to remember who they were, whose descendants now stood in this gallery reclaiming their ancestors' true identities. As visitors moved through the exhibition, reading the documents and examining the photograph, Daniel thought about all the other photographs that might exist in attics and estate sales across the country, containing similar hidden stories waiting to be uncovered. How many other children had been erased from history, renamed and forgotten? How many families had searched in vain for lost sons and daughters? The photograph would remain in the museum's permanent collection, a testament to both the injustices of the past and the power of historical investigation to restore truth. The faces of Sarah, Thomas, and Elizabeth would be seen by thousands of visitors, no longer invisible, no longer voiceless, finally acknowledged for who they had always been. Children who had been wronged but never broken, who had survived, and whose stories now served as a reminder that every photograph contains layers of truth, waiting for someone with patience and compassion to bring them into the light.